volunteers. I think we hit on this earlier, and it um, is just valuing them and telling them how much you value them and pouring into them. Um, one thing that I really took, uh, you know, is something Dr. Ross said in one of the lectures is not to surprise volunteers, but really keep them a part of in the loop of everything that's going on, and not to surprise them like on a Sunday morning with an event that you just planned the night before and you didn't tell anybody, and you're telling the students before you even tell your volunteers, and it kind of makes them feel less. And so just making them valuing them and teaching them, most importantly, just to love God, and discipling them is a big thing that, as also we've learned, is learning how to disciple those leaders that you have, and walking alongside them in their families if they have them, or if they're young adults, walking alongside them throughout that.
Mhm. If you, it's such a like I think this is a question we could really sit and talk about for forever. Really,
Yeah.
a big one I think is that they're called to make disciples just as someone who is in a ministry position is. Oh, that a position we learned of here a while back. I don't remember. It might be a different class. It's a different way. In the an evangelism class I took one time, it was the view on evangelism. It was like the professional, like fisherman view, something along on the sorts, basically that only those who are professional, like that's their craft, like they're the ones that need to evangelize. They're the ones that need to make disciples, and the people that just attend church, that's not really their responsibility. But the Great Commission is really meant for the people who are pastors, and that's not true. And every volunteer who is a professing Christ, they are called to the Great Commission, just like we are. They're called to make disciples, and so and I imagine we could all tell stories about in the American church, right? Like it's at least in the American church context, it's very much a consumerist mentality at the moment. And instead of no, we need to go outside the walls and to make disciples and to share Jesus and to be a light. And when you to many of y'all's points, right? Like the adults that make that connection that you might not be able to, right? Like there's a student, let's say, that you don't have an easy time connecting with, but for some reason that adult does, and that volunteer is able to become a point to enter into a discipleship relationship and makes a difference in the life of a teenager. And just because they're their body's in a room, and are grateful for those that can be adult supervision, right? But every volunteer is called to a higher calling than that, and that's to go therefore make disciples.
I think you're muted. Mitchell, you're muted.
Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, but I think Derek really hit the nail on the head there. I think if there's two things I could kind of instill in volunteers, it's just that, one, that not just professional ministers are called to disciple people, but everyone is, and make them understand the need of discipling students. I think to a certain extent as a Christian, I think at its face value, if you ask pretty much any adult that's volunteering in a church, I mean, obviously they're giving their own free time to work in a church and work with students. So on some level, they realize that there's a need there to disciple these students, but to really make them understand the eternal implications for it, and really make them understand the need for the depth, and that it goes a little bit past eating pizza and having fun. And it's like, hey, like these students need to see that you're living a Christian life in spite of the culture that we live in spite of the world we live in. They need to see that adult example, because it's one thing for you to sit in a classroom with them on Sunday morning and say, hey guys, this is what the Bible says we need to do. But if they see you living that actively, then it's going to totally change their perspective on what being a Christian is. And so I think kind of one, making them understand that need for, hey, this is the way we're going to make disciples. We understand that's important. One of the big things here is that they're going to be able to look up to you and see that you're actually living that way. And the second is just kind of making adults understand that that's the way you're going to grow a group. That's the way you're going to disciple more people. The more adults you have plugged in, the more volunteers you have, the more contact points you're going to have, the more relationships you're going to be able to build, and ultimately the more lost people you're going to be able to bring to Christ. And I think whenever volunteers realize that, and whenever you kind of empower them to understand that with their kind of behind their purpose, I think that even, I mean, sure, a Chick-fil-A gift card goes a long way, or like a small Christmas gift or something saying, hey, we appreciate you, or a signed letter or whatever. Like all that stuff goes a long way. But I think even more motivating them and making them feel valued is having them kind of understand their purpose. But yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've kind of had to learn the hard way myself, but I think just making sure that volunteers understand that no matter how long they're in that position for, they can still make an impact. They can still pour into the students' lives. They can still make those deep connections. Like you may not be pouring into that relationship in the context of that specific, say, Wednesday night, Sunday morning stuff, but you can still, whenever you move out of that time that you've served there, you can still be pouring into that student. You can make a lasting impact through that. I know there's volunteers that I've connected with more than the student minister, and they haven't been, they weren't part of the youth group for that long, but even just that little connection that I've made with them has lasted for several years. So I think just understanding that whether you're there for, 1 year or 5, you're still able to pour into these students the same way, I would say. But just don't let the time that you're there hinder the quality that you're giving these students.
One thing I would like to say that ministers must cherish volunteers because they are so important in our ministry. Volunteers sacrifice their time, energy, strength, and money, but they are not paid for their service. They serve because of the love of God. If ministers invite them to take part in the ministry, the ministers carefully explain how their works and duties are important and show them how they can do it and let them work with others. And the ministers should take care of it. And so ministers do not let the volunteers work alone by themselves. Volunteers need a fellowship with you, ministers, and others. Yeah, so if volunteers do some work and serve the ministry, it would be helpful for volunteers to work together.